we are protected from it, and that's kind of the problem.
Andrew McNamara is Queensland State Labor MP for the seat of Hervey Bay, and he's a rare politician because he's actually raised this issue of peak oil, and when he raised it recently, it made page 76 of The Australian. Andrew? Hi, does the fact that your comments made page 76 show how seriously this is being treated at the moment?
Well, I guess you've got to start somewhere, and the real challenge has been to get it off the financial pages and the resources columns and onto the front page. It's a curious issue because it's not a secret, but by the same token, it hasn't been front of the room at all in politics.
How did you find out about it?
A scientist up here in Hervey Bay has been talking about it for a while, and eventually convinced me to read a book, scared me senseless, and I walked into Parliament for the first session this year and started talking about it and haven't shut up since.
What scared you, Andrew?
Well, what scares me is whether we're going to handle this or not. I'm with James Kunstler. I don't think this has to be an apocalypse at all, but only on the basis that we confront the issue, which means finding more conventional oil, doing more with alternatives and renewables, and coming to terms with reducing demand, because the danger is that the total energy shortfall which we face won't be able to be met by any of the other alternatives, renewables and conventional sources. We're going to have to reduce, and we're just not talking about that. In order to get the public to accept a reduction in the way we use oil, it requires a lot of talking.
Andrew, politicians have short cycles, 3 years in federal politics, 4 in some states. How do you convince politicians and ministers and prime ministers and premiers to care about things that are happening perhaps when they're retired from politics?
Well, I guess this is no longer a long-term issue. Oil production in the Bass Strait dropped by 14% last year, and I think the numbers that are starting to come through now are really starting to tweak that sort of this is a now problem concept. And the Oil and Gas Journal just in February this year suggested that non-OPEC, excluding the former Soviet Union, which is us, is going to have its peak of production 2005-06, and that's happening. That's Australia, that's Indonesia. And again, that Oil and Gas Journal is a very conservative journal. We're not talking about any sort of garden backyard newspaper. It's the oil industry's Bible. They're talking about a world peak of production in 2015. And again, even for 3-year politicians, 10 years is a time frame we can conceptualise.
Andrew, thanks for talking to us about it.
Okay.
Andrew McNamara, State Labor MP in Queensland for the seat of Hervey Bay. We're talking about the future of oil. Many people are saying we've reached the peak and that it's declining. With us is Sonia Shah, author of Crude, The Story of Oil, and also Alex Wadsley, who's a former analyst in the oil industry, and he's doing a PhD in economics at the University of Tasmania. Alex, the last federal election was a lot about economics. You're saying that this could have an impact on the economy. Why wasn't it talked about?
Well, I guess in terms of oil is not an issue that the politicians chose to talk about in the election. I think the election we had was one where the politicians decided amongst themselves what they were going to talk about, and that's what they talked about. They didn't talk about the necessity of having a carbon tax as being one of those mechanisms which in a market would encourage people towards using non-fossil fuel sources. We didn't have that debate. It was in some parties' policies, but not others. We didn't talk about Kyoto. I think they talked about interest rates, and I think the question is going to be, well, actually, oil can or will come down to affect the interest rates. When the shortages of oil come in, people will be required to invest in new technology, in finding new oil elsewhere. That's going to be very expensive because it's going to be offshore. It's going to be involving large processing plants, or it's going to be going for much smaller fields. That's going to put interest rates up. And I think the fact that politicians don't talk about it is the same about Kyoto and greenhouse and all the other environmental/economic issues that should be addressed in a concerted way, but simply aren't in the current debate.
Okay, a couple of quick questions from some listeners that I don't know if either of you could answer. Michael wants to know, is LPG a viable alternative? Neil wants to know, what about ethanol?
LPG, not in the long run. LPG will run out just as quickly as oil will. It's a byproduct from the refineries and is produced from gas fields. So it's going to run out. Maybe it might take slightly longer in terms of some of the large gas fields will outlive the large oil fields, but it's not a long-term solution.
Ethanol?
The question about ethanol is how much energy are you putting into the ethanol to get the ethanol out? The problem you've got is that ethanol takes a lot of heating processes to actually generate the ethanol, so that perhaps for every, say, litre of ethanol you're producing, you might be using 0.7 of a litre of oil. So you're only getting a little bit of extra drive.
Sonia, what about the question of China in all of this? I mean, China was a country until recently that a lot of people rode bikes, and now there's more people driving cars, and a lot of oil is being consumed in China. What impact's that going to have on the dwindling oil reserves?
Well, I think actually China's oil demand is sort of key in this whole question about why the market is so tight right now, which is part of why we're even having this conversation to begin with. And you know, I mean, Chinese demand is increasing much faster than any other country's demand for oil is increasing, but their overall demand is still much less. I mean, if you look at per capita, you know, Americans use 3 gallons of oil a day, Australians use 2 gallons of oil a day, Chinese people use maybe 0.15 gallon of oil a day. So it's a much smaller quantity, but of course it's a much huger population. And, you know, the World Bank and the IMF and different international financial institutions have worked really hard at helping China and other developing countries sort of develop their economies to the point where they are building roads and they are building new auto showrooms and all the rest of it to sort of sell the petro life, which is how we envision the developed society to be. And that's what's happening in China now. They're just on a frenzy of road building.
Sonia, in your book you asked the question, the coming oil crisis, who will pay the price? Giant oil companies and SUV makers, or African villages and the Antarctic wilderness? Can you answer the question that you posed?
I wish I could. I mean, I think the signs are really mixed. You know, on one hand, we see the City of London where driving has been banned on certain areas. You know, there's in Japan, for example, there's some cities that have decided to outlaw all garbage by, you know, within the next 10 or 12 years. In India, in Mumbai, which used to be Bombay, they have a blackout every night, 6 to 10 o'clock, you know. I mean, there's some places that are really making huge strides forward in cutting consumption, not just of energy, but natural resources that rely on energy. So that's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is what James Kunstler is talking about, you know, suburban sprawl continuing, and the fact that global demand for oil is still going up 2% every year. We haven't seen a big softening yet, even though prices have nearly doubled.
Alex, you're doing the PhD in economics. Who do you think might be going to pay the price?
I think it will be the developing countries. In the West, we have access to the technology and the capital to solve the problem. But those countries are heavily dependent on oil for their growth. If the barrel of oil in their economy goes a lot further than it does in ours, and I think we see the risk of revolution when the oil slows, it goes too high, and they can't get the economic growth that they've been told to expect.
What kind of revolution?
Well, I guess you've seen in Indonesia when they cut the subsidies on diesel, that brought people out onto the streets. You've got people out on the streets in Bolivia talking about nationalisation of their oil industry. I think there's issues about whether China will be willing to see its economic growth constrained so that India can get oil, or Japan can get oil, or the US can get oil. And I think countries will start looking at other options about how can they make sure that what is left in the world is given to their people rather than any other people's, and that may lead to war.
And the people in the West will, as per usual, try and stitch up their own resources?
Absolutely, but the place where the oil is going to be Russia, and it's going to be the Middle East and West Africa. So we're all going to be in that scramble.
Alex and Sonia, thanks for talking to us about it this afternoon.